My daughter-in-law laughed and said, "The mansion is ours now." She didn't know I was standing behind the door. I remember the exact sound of her laugh. Not loud, not cruel, just confident, as if ownership were something that arrived naturally with marriage, like a shared last name. I stood there longer than I should have, my hand resting on the doorframe, feeling the smooth wood under my fingers the way you feel something familiar for reassurance. The word mansion felt strange to me. I had never called it that. To me, it was simply the house, the place where my footsteps had worn paths into the floors and my voice had once filled the rooms without effort. I waited for my son to say something then. I waited for a pause, a correction, even a joke to soften it. Instead, there was a quiet agreement in his silence, the kind that settles gently but carries weight. I stepped back before they could see me, moving slowly, carefully, as if speed might betray the moment I had just witnessed. In my room, I sat down and folded my hands in my lap. They were steady. That surprised me. I thought they would shake. The house around me continued as if nothing had happened, the low hum of appliances, the distant sound of voices drifting and then fading. I looked around my room, the small one at the end of the hall that I had moved into after my husband passed, telling myself it was easier to keep the rest of the house open for when my son visited. At some point, without anyone asking, my visits turned into their stays, and my stay became quieter, smaller. I had not noticed when that happened, or maybe I had but chose not to name it. Loneliness is easier to manage when it arrives gradually. You learn to adjust your expectations instead of questioning why they changed. I told myself that families shift, that children grow into their own lives, and mothers learn to step back. That was what I had believed, and belief can be a comfortable thing when it is not challenged directly. But standing behind that door, hearing my home spoken of as a conclusion already reached, something in me began to reorganize itself. Not anger, not fear, awareness. I thought about the years I had lived there alone after my husband's death, how the rooms had echoed at first, then slowly learned my quieter rhythms. I thought about the decisions I had made, always with the idea of preserving something for my son, something solid in a world that had taken his father too early. I wondered when preservation had started to look like surrender. Later that evening, we sat at the same table for dinner. They spoke about work, about travel plans, about renovations they had seen online, all of it framed as possibilities, nothing stated outright. I listened and nodded when appropriate. I had learned long ago that asking questions sometimes invites answers you are not ready to hear. My daughter-in-law smiled at me kindly, almost absently, the way people do when they assume affection is a given and therefore requires no effort. My son avoided my eyes more than usual. That detail stayed with me. After dinner, I washed the dishes myself, though she offered to help. I said it was fine. It was easier to be useful in ways that did not require conversation. That night, sleep came in fragments. I woke up more than once, listening to the house settle, the faint creaks and sighs that had always comforted me. This time they felt like reminders. In the morning, I moved through my routine carefully, deliberately, as if I were observing myself from a distance. I made tea, I opened the curtains, I sat by the window and watched the street wake up. Ordinary things have a way of grounding you when your thoughts begin to drift toward uncomfortable truths. I told myself that words spoken lightly do not always reflect intention. I told myself that laughter can be careless, that people speak without thinking. Still, the sentence repeated itself quietly in my mind, not accusatory, just present. The mansion is ours now. I realized then that no one had asked me anything. No one had wondered how I felt or what I planned. Assumptions had filled the space where conversation should have been. That is how decisions often take shape, not through confrontation, but through omission. Over the next few days, nothing outward changed. Meals were shared, polite conversation continued, plans were discussed around me, not with me. I responded as I always had, calmly with small smiles and short answers. Inside, something was shifting, though I could not have explained it if asked. It was not resolve yet, it was attention. I began noticing details I had once overlooked, the way paperwork was left out on the counter, the way doors were closed a little more firmly, the way my presence seemed to require acknowledgement rather than being assumed. I did not feel invisible exactly. I felt accounted for, like an item noted but not considered. One afternoon, as I passed the hallway where I had first heard her words, I paused without meaning to. The door was open now, the room empty. Light streamed in, unchanged. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the quiet. It occurred to me that this house had been listening to me for years, holding my secrets without judgment. I wondered what it had heard that day and what it might still be holding. I turned away before that thought could settle too deeply. There would be time for understanding later. For now, I stayed where I was, doing what I had always done, waiting, watching, and saying nothing, even as the feeling grew that something important was moving forward without me, and silence, once chosen for peace, might soon demand a different purpose. The days after that settled into a rhythm that looked peaceful from the outside. Breakfasts were quiet, shared at the long table where my husband once read the paper aloud, commenting on stories that no longer mattered. Now the paper lay folded, untouched, while my son checked his phone and my daughter-in-law planned her mornings with confident efficiency. I listened more than I spoke. That had become natural to me. When you live alone long enough, words begin to feel heavier, like things you should only carry when necessary. They spoke about errands, about friends I had not met, about changes they wanted to make to the house, all phrased gently, as ideas, never decisions. I noticed how often they used the word we. We should repaint this room. We could open that wall. We might host something here. The word drifted through the air easily, never landing on me, never including me, but never explicitly pushing me out either. It was a careful balance, one that allowed everyone to pretend nothing had shifted. I told myself that this was what adaptation looked like, that families expanded and contracted, and that my role was to make space. Still, there was a quiet ache in realizing that space, once made, is rarely returned. I began to retreat further into the smaller corners of the house, not out of resentment, but out of instinct. It is easier to protect yourself when you occupy less territory. I spent more time in my room, organizing drawers that did not need organizing, rereading old letters simply to remind myself that I had once been spoken to directly. My daughter-in-law was not unkind. That was perhaps the most difficult part. She greeted me politely, asked if I had slept well, complimented the meals I prepared. Kindness, when paired with assumption, can be disorienting. It gives you no clear place to object. My son, on the other hand, had grown quieter around me, as if he were afraid that conversation might drift into areas he preferred to avoid. Sometimes I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between guilt and relief. I did not ask him what he was thinking. I had raised him to be honest, but I had also raised him to avoid conflict, and I suspected honesty would not surface without pressure. I was not ready to apply any. One afternoon, I overheard them discussing a gathering they wanted to host, voices carrying from the living room while I sat in the kitchen peeling apples. She spoke animatedly, describing how the space could be arranged, how impressive the house would look once certain changes were made. He laughed, agreeing, adding details. No one asked if I minded. No one asked if I would like to be there. I peeled the apples carefully, making sure the strips came off clean and unbroken. There is something meditative about repetitive tasks, something that keeps your thoughts from spiraling too far. Still, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, not sharp but persistent, like a reminder you cannot silence. That evening, I declined to join them for television. I said I was tired. It was true, though not in the way they likely assumed. I lay in bed listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and dialogue drifting down the hall. It felt strange to be an audience to my own home. I wondered when I had stopped being central to it. The answer did not come immediately, but I suspected it had been gradual, disguised as convenience, as generosity. I had offered the larger bedroom. I had suggested they stay longer. I had told myself that love meant accommodation. Perhaps it did, but accommodation, when unreciprocated, begins to feel like erasure. The following morning, I noticed documents spread across the dining table, papers with headings and diagrams. I did not read them. I did not need to. The presence of them was enough. They were discussing something that extended beyond daily life, something structural. I made tea and carried it back to my room, leaving the papers undisturbed. Curiosity stirred, but I resisted it. I was not ready to look too closely. Looking invites conclusions, and conclusions demand response. Instead, I paid attention to smaller things, how often my daughter-in-law referred to the house as this place instead of your home, how she rearranged items without asking, not maliciously, just confidently, how my son deferred to her opinions, nodding along, his voice quieter when speaking to me than when speaking to her. None of this was dramatic. That was what made it unsettling. There was no argument to respond to, no insult to confront, just a slow repositioning in which I found myself less centered each day. One afternoon, she asked casually if I had plans for the weekend. I said no. She smiled and said that was good because they might have people over and things could get busy. The implication was gentle but clear. I nodded. After she left the room, I sat for a long time, staring at the closed door. It occurred to me then that my life had become to feel provisional, as if I were waiting for instructions that would arrive without warning. I thought about my husband, about how he had always insisted on clarity, on naming things directly. He would have addressed the situation openly, perhaps too openly. I had been the quieter one, the observer. That worked for us. Alone, it felt less certain. That night, I took a slow walk through the house after everyone had gone to bed. I touched the banister, the walls, the familiar edges of furniture. I was not saying goodbye, not yet. I was reminding myself that memory still lived here, even if its claim was no longer acknowledged aloud. I returned to my room with a strange mix of sadness and resolve, though the resolve had no shape yet, only a sense that continuing to disappear quietly was no longer an option, even if I did not yet know what replacing silence would require. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped under my door as if it were something private, though nothing about it felt that way once I picked it up. The envelope was thick, expensive, my son's name written neatly on the front, and beneath it, almost as an afterthought, mine. I sat on the bed and turned it over in my hands for a long time before opening it. When I did, the paper inside was crisp and formal, announcing their wedding date, the venue, the schedule of events. A small card was tucked inside with a brief note written in her handwriting, telling me she hoped I would attend and that it would mean a lot to the family. The word family stood out to me more than anything else. I read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. For a moment, something like relief moved through me. An invitation implies inclusion, acknowledgement. It suggested that perhaps I had misread everything, that assumptions had grown heavier in my mind than they were in reality. I told myself that weddings bring out strange behavior in people, that stress rearranges priorities temporarily. I allowed myself to imagine sitting quietly among familiar faces, watching my son take vows, feeling that sense of continuity that mothers are supposed to feel at such moments. The idea brought a softness I hadn't felt in weeks. In the days that followed, there were conversations about logistics. She asked if I needed help finding a dress. He asked if I was comfortable with the travel arrangements. Their concern felt genuine enough that I did not question it. I began to prepare, selecting something simple from my closet, nothing too old-fashioned, nothing that would draw attention. I wanted to blend in, not disappear, but not stand out either. The day of the wedding arrived bright and clear. The venue was impressive, all polished surfaces and carefully arranged flowers. I arrived early, as I always do, and took a seat where I could see without being seen too much myself. Guests filtered in, laughter and greetings filling the space. When my daughter-in-law appeared, she looked radiant, confident, entirely at ease in the attention. My son stood beside her, smiling, his posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. I felt a familiar swell of pride, mixed with something quieter, more complicated. The ceremony proceeded as ceremonies do, words spoken, promises made. I listened carefully, not for the vows themselves, but for what was left unsaid. When it was over, applause filled the room and everyone stood. I stood too, clapping politely, feeling the moment pass through me without settling. At the reception, tables were arranged beautifully, place cards set out in neat rows. I found mine after a short search, located near the edge of the room, far from the head table. That did not surprise me. I sat down and observed, sipping water, listening to the conversations around me. Speeches were given, friends spoke warmly. Then my daughter-in-law took the microphone. She thanked everyone for coming, spoke about new beginnings, about building a future together. Her words were well chosen, practiced. Then she laughed lightly and made a comment about how life changes when you step into a new home, how exciting it was to finally feel settled. A few people laughed along. My son smiled. I felt the air shift slightly, though no one else seemed to notice. She continued, mentioning how grateful she was for the support that had made their lifestyle possible, how some things are passed down and others are claimed. The phrasing was subtle, but it landed. I felt my face grow warm. It was not humiliation in the dramatic sense. No one pointed at me, no one spoke my name, but I understood that the room was being invited to share an assumption I had not agreed to. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, listening as if from a distance. When the applause came, I joined in, softly. Afterward, she approached me with a smile, asking if I was enjoying myself. I told her yes. It was the truth in a limited way. I was enjoying the clarity. Later, as people mingled, I overheard fragments of conversation, comments about the house, about how lucky they were, about how generous it must be to have everything lined up so early. I realized then that a narrative had already been established, and I was not part of its authorship. I was its footnote. I left early, citing fatigue. My son hugged me briefly, thanked me for coming. His embrace felt careful. On the ride home, the quiet pressed in around me. Back in the house, now decorated with congratulatory cards and flowers, I went straight to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and removed my shoes slowly, deliberately. For a long time, I did nothing else. The relief I had felt when the invitation arrived had drained away, replaced with something heavier, but also more solid. I had been included, yes, but inclusion without respect is its own kind of exclusion. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of celebration continuing elsewhere. It was then that the understanding settled fully. Whatever hope I had been holding on to, quietly, carefully, had been misplaced. The breaking point did not come with tears or raised voices. It came with a calm recognition that waiting for consideration had only made me smaller, and that if I continued as I was, the story being told would harden into fact without my consent. I closed my eyes and let that realization sit with me, knowing that something would have to change, even if I did not yet know how, and that the silence I had relied on for so long was beginning to feel less like protection and more like permission. After the wedding, the house felt different in a way I could not immediately name. It was not louder or quieter, not messier or more orderly. It felt claimed. Cards and flowers filled the entryway, gifts stacked neatly against the wall as if awaiting instructions. My daughter-in-law moved through the rooms with a new confidence, greeting neighbors who stopped by to offer congratulations, speaking easily about plans and timelines. My son returned to work, falling back into routines that no longer included checking in with me the way he once had. I watched all of this from a distance that was not physical, but emotional, as though I were standing just outside a window, able to see clearly, but unable to be heard. People congratulated me, too, telling me how proud I must be, how lucky I was to have such a successful son, such an impressive future ahead of the family. I smiled and thanked them. It seemed unnecessary to correct a story that no one wanted revised. Inside, something had gone quiet. The hope that had flickered briefly with the invitation and the ceremony had gone out completely, leaving behind a steady, unsentimental awareness. This was not phase, it was a transition, and I was not the one being transitioned into. One evening, a week or so after the wedding, she asked if we could talk. We sat at the dining table, just the two of us. Her tone was gentle, rehearsed. She spoke about how much things were changing, how important it was to think ahead, how families need to adapt to new realities. She said they wanted to make the house more suitable for entertaining, for their future, and that it might be easier for me if I considered downsizing, something more manageable. She framed it as concern, as practicality. She never once asked what I wanted. I listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally to show I was following. When she finished, she smiled, waiting for reassurance, perhaps gratitude. I told her I understood. That was all. The conversation ended there, neatly, efficiently. Later, alone in my room, I replayed her words slowly, examining them not for cruelty, but for intent. There was none of the former, plenty of the latter. She believed what she was saying. That made it more dangerous. Over the next days, suggestions turned into assumptions. Boxes appeared in the hallway, empty at first, then gradually filled. Items were moved, reorganized, labeled. Some of them were mine. No one asked before doing it. I noticed that my name had been written on the boxes in a neat, unfamiliar hand. I did not protest. I simply began paying closer attention. I noticed how often documents were discussed in lowered voices, how certain drawers were locked, how conversations paused when I entered a room. None of it was dramatic. It was methodical, the kind of process that moves forward because no one stops it. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the living room, looking at a framed photograph that had been moved from its usual place. It was of my husband and me, taken years ago, smiling awkwardly at the camera. It had been relocated to a shelf behind a row of newer pictures, partially obscured. I adjusted it slightly, then stopped, my hand hovering. I let it remain where it was. That felt important. That evening, I overheard them discussing timelines again, this time more openly. She mentioned how quickly things could be finalized once paperwork was complete. He agreed, sounding tired but compliant. They spoke as if I were already elsewhere, as if my presence were temporary, a logistical detail rather than a life. I did not confront them. I did not announce anything. Instead, I retreated further into observation. There is a clarity that comes when you stop expecting fairness. I began to see patterns, to recognize leverage points, though I did not yet name them as such. I spent time in the study, ostensibly sorting old files, though really I was reacquainting myself with the shape of my life, the records it had left behind. I read slowly, carefully, taking note of dates, signatures, margins. I did not feel clever or triumphant. I felt grounded. One evening, my son knocked on my door. He asked if I was all right. His voice was tentative. I told him I was fine. He lingered as if wanting to say more, then left. I realized then that whatever discomfort he felt was outweighed by the ease of letting things continue as they were. I could not change that for him. I could only decide what it meant for me. Sleep became lighter. I woke easily, listening, thinking, not planning exactly, but aligning myself with a reality I had avoided acknowledging. The house no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a stage on which my role was being quietly written out. Still, I moved through it with care, with respect, as I always had. I cooked with needed, I cleaned without complaint, I answered questions simply. Inside, the sense of being pushed aside hardened into something more defined, not resentment, but resolute without urgency. The kind that waits for the right moment without announcing itself. One morning, as I passed the hallway mirror, I paused and looked at myself more closely than I had in years. I did not see a woman defeated. I saw someone who had been underestimated because she had chosen calm over confrontation. That realization did not make me smile, it made me attentive. Later that day, I noticed a small, dark lens tucked discreetly in the corner of the living room, newly installed, angled just so. No one mentioned it, no one explained. I pretended not to see it, but I understood then that watching was no longer one-sided, and that whatever story was unfolding was moving toward a point where silence would no longer be mistaken for absence. After I noticed the camera, I did not change anything about how I lived. That felt important. I continued to move through the house the way I always had, unhurried, predictable, careful not to draw attention. If anything, I became quieter. Silence, when chosen deliberately, has a different quality than silence born of uncertainty. I assumed the lens watched me as often as it watched them, capturing moments no one would review unless they were needed. I wondered who had suggested it and for what purpose, but I did not ask. Asking would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have invited explanations I did not trust. Instead, I watched. Observation has always been my strength. When you raise a child alone for part of his life, you learn to notice changes in tone, posture, timing. You learn when something is being hidden not by what is said, but by what is avoided. My daughter-in-law spoke freely in front of me, but her eyes shifted when conversations turned to practical matters. My son spoke less, but his pauses were more revealing than his words. I noticed how often documents appeared on the table and disappeared again. I noticed how mail was sorted quickly now, envelopes opened before I could see names. None of this surprised me. It confirmed what I already understood. I spent more time alone, not out of sadness, but because solitude gave me space to think clearly. I walked in the mornings, slowly, taking the same route I had for years. Neighbors waved, asked polite questions. I answered vaguely. There was comfort in routine, in knowing where the pavement cracked and where the trees cast shade at certain hours. It reminded me that my world extended beyond the walls of the house, even if I had allowed it to shrink. In the afternoons, I returned to the study. I told them I was organizing old records, which was true, though perhaps not in the way they imagined. I moved deliberately through files, touching paper that held the weight of decisions made long ago. I did not rush. I did not jump to conclusions. I simply familiarized myself again with what already existed. Knowledge, I was reminded, does not announce itself loudly. It waits patiently for recognition. At dinner, conversation continued as before. Plans were discussed with increasing confidence. Renovations were mentioned more concretely. Timelines were implied. I responded when addressed. Otherwise, I listened. I did not argue. There was nothing to argue yet. One evening, she spoke about how quickly things move once everything is signed, how efficient processes can be when everyone is aligned. My son nodded, his eyes on his plate. I thought about alignment and how easily it is confused with compliance. Afterward, alone in my room, I sat in the dark for a long time, letting the quiet settle. I did not feel afraid. That surprised me. Fear requires uncertainty. I felt instead a steady awareness, like standing at the edge of deep water and knowing exactly how cold it will be. Over the next weeks, I noticed subtle changes in how they interacted with each other. There was tension beneath their coordination, small disagreements quickly smoothed over, stress, perhaps, or impatience. I wondered if either of them noticed how often I was absent from their discussions, not physically, but in terms of consideration. I doubted it. People tend not to miss what they have already decided is temporary. I began to write more, filling pages in a notebook I kept tucked away. I did not write about them. I wrote about myself, about memories, about what I wanted my days to look like if I were free to choose without accommodation. It felt indulgent at first, then necessary. Writing clarified things I had left vague for too long. It reminded me that I was still capable of defining my own narrative. One afternoon, I heard raised voices for the first time. Not shouting, but urgency. I paused in the hallway, listening. They were discussing numbers, figures that carried weight even without context. The conversation ended abruptly when they realized I was nearby. Apologies followed, awkward and unnecessary. I smiled and said it was fine. And it was, because the sound of strain confirmed that momentum does not eliminate consequence. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. In the morning, I woke with a sense of calm that felt earned. I made breakfast, cleaned up, and spent time in the garden, tending to plants that had survived multiple seasons with little intervention. Growth, I reflected, often happens quietly, unnoticed until it is undeniable. As days passed, the camera remained, silent and unobtrusive. I did not look at it directly again. There was no need. I assumed it continued to collect moments, conversations, assumptions. I assumed it recorded laughter and certainty. I did not know then how much it would matter, only that truth has a way of gathering itself when people stop being careful. I continued to wait, not passively, but with intention. Waiting is not inaction when it is paired with awareness, it is restraint. I had learned restraint early in life, learned when to speak and when to let silence do the work. This felt like one of those moments, though the stakes were higher than I had ever faced. One evening, my son mentioned an upcoming appointment, something he needed to attend during business hours. He did not say what it was for. I nodded, wished him well. After he left the room, I remained seated, hands folded, listening to the hum of the house. The sense of movement towards something final grew stronger, like the pressure change before a storm. I did not know exactly when it would break, only that it would, and when it did, I intended to be present, not as an obstacle, but as someone who understood the terrain far better than anyone realized. The appointment my son mentioned came and went without further explanation, but its presence lingered in the house like a faint echo. After that day, their conversations took on a sharper edge of urgency, though still wrapped in polite tones. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law checked her phone now, how she paced while speaking quietly to someone I never saw. I noticed how my son began coming home later, his shoulders tense, his replies shorter. I remained exactly the same. I cooked, I cleaned, I greeted them calmly. Predictability, I had learned, makes people careless. When nothing appears to resist, momentum accelerates. I spent more time in places where I was unlikely to be noticed: the garden, the study, the far end of the hallway. I was not hiding, I was giving them space to assume. Assumption is powerful, it fills silence with confidence. One afternoon, while sorting through old files again, I came across a folder I hadn't opened in years. I did not rush through it. I read every page slowly, as if rereading a letter from someone I used to know. There was comfort in the familiarity of it, in the certainty of ink and paper that did not change its meaning depending on who held it. I closed the folder carefully and returned it to its place. I felt no surge of triumph, no excitement, only steadiness. That evening, my daughter-in-law spoke to me more directly than she had in weeks. She asked how I was feeling about everything, her voice gentle, her posture attentive. I considered her question carefully. How I was feeling was not the same as what she needed to hear. I told her I was managing, that change always requires adjustment. She smiled, relieved, and thanked me for being understanding. Understanding, I reflected later, is often mistaken for agreement. Over dinner, they discussed timelines again, this time more openly. She spoke about next steps, about paperwork moving through the right channels, about how nice it would be once things were settled. My son nodded along, occasionally adding details. Neither of them looked at me. I ate quietly, savoring the simple act of nourishment. There is a dignity in continuing to care for yourself, even when others have stopped considering you. That night, I returned to my notebook and wrote until my hand ached. I wrote about the early years of the house, about the sacrifices that had made it possible, about the promises my husband and I had made to each other. Writing grounded me in truth, not the version being circulated around me, but the one I had lived. It reminded me that I was not an obstacle in someone else's story. I was the origin of my own. Days passed, boxes accumulated. Some of my belongings are moved into storage without discussion. I let them go. Objects can be replaced. What mattered with clarity. One morning, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone, her voice sharp with frustration. She spoke about delays, about people being overly cautious, about how everything should have been straightforward. She lowered her voice when she noticed me nearby, offering a quick smile as she ended the call. I returned the smile, unbothered. Inside, something settled more firmly into place. When people grow impatient, they reveal more than they intend. Later that day, I noticed the camera again, its small presence unchanged. I wondered how much it had seen, how many assumptions had been spoken freely beneath its lens. I wondered if anyone had considered that watching cuts both ways, that observation is not ownership. Still, I said nothing. Silence continued to do its work. My son knocked on my door again one evening, more hesitant this time. He asked if we could talk soon, said there were things he wanted to explain. I told him we could talk whenever he was ready. He nodded, relieved, and left. I did not follow him. Explanations offered late are rarely about understanding. They are about easing conscience. I slept lightly that night, not from worry, but from anticipation. The sense that something long deferred was approaching grew stronger, no longer vague. In the morning, I woke early and made tea, sitting at the kitchen table as the sun rose. The house looked peaceful, unchanged, as if it were unaware of the shifting ground beneath it. I placed my hands around the warm cup and breathed slowly. I felt present in a way I had not for a long time. That afternoon, an unfamiliar envelope arrived in the mail. My daughter-in-law reached for it automatically, then paused when she saw the name. She handed it to my son instead. They exchanged a glance. I did not ask what it was. I did not need to. The room felt tight, charged. They moved away to open it privately. I remained where I was, folding laundry, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation behind closed doors. Voices rose slightly, then fell. When they returned, their expressions were carefully neutral. She spoke cheerfully about dinner plans. He agreed a little too quickly. I folded the last towel and set it aside, aware that the shape of the moment had changed. Something had not gone as smoothly as expected. That evening passed quietly, almost too quietly. I went to bed early, not from fatigue, but because I sensed that rest would soon be harder to come by. As I lay in the dark, I felt neither fear nor satisfaction, only readiness. Whatever they believed was already decided was still in motion, and motion, I knew, does not always move in the direction people assume, especially when they forget that patience, when paired with awareness, is not weakness, but preparation. The next morning began without ceremony. No raised voices, no hurried movements. My daughter-in-law left early, dressed carefully, her confidence a little too deliberate. My son followed not long after, saying he had another appointment. He did not meet my eyes when he spoke. I wished him a good day and meant it. When the house emptied, I did not rush to do anything. I made breakfast, washed the dishes, and sat by the window for a while, watching the street settle into its usual rhythm. It felt important not to treat the day as extraordinary, even though I sensed it was. Around midday, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered calmly. The voice on the other end was professional, measured. He introduced himself, confirmed my name, and asked if I had a few moments to discuss a matter related to my property. He did not say mansion. That alone felt grounding. We spoke briefly. He explained that there had been some confusion regarding recent filings, that certain assumptions had been made without full verification. He asked if I would be willing to come in or if I preferred to handle things remotely. I told him I would come in. I dressed simply and took my time. At the office, I was greeted politely, offered water, asked to sit. Documents were laid out in front of me, familiar ones alongside newer papers that had not yet settled into final form. The man explained, carefully, that while attempts had been made to move things forward, the foundational ownership structure had not changed. He spoke about safeguards, about long-standing arrangements, about how certain actions require explicit consent that had never been given. I listened, nodding. Nothing he said surprised me. That was perhaps the most telling part. When he finished, he asked if I had questions. I asked only one, whether there was any immediate risk. He assured me there was not. The matter, he said, was clear once everything was properly reviewed. Clarity, it turned out, had been there all along. It simply hadn't been consulted. I returned home in the afternoon. The house was quiet. I sat in the living room for a while, noticing the camera again, still fixed in its corner. I wondered briefly what it had captured over the past weeks, not just words, but tone. Not just confidence, but certainty spoken aloud before it had been earned. I did not touch it. That evening, my son came home first. He looked tired, unsettled. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. We sat at the dining table, the same place where so many assumptions had been spoken as facts. He struggled to begin. Finally, he told me there had been a misunderstanding, that things had moved too quickly, that paperwork hadn't gone the way they expected. He spoke carefully, choosing words that avoided responsibility without denying involvement. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I told him I was aware. He looked up, startled. I did not explain how. I did not need to. Shortly after, my daughter-in-law arrived. She sensed the shift immediately. She asked what was going on, her tone light but edged. My son deferred to me, gesturing slightly. I told her calmly that there had been some confusion regarding ownership and that it had been clarified. Her expression tightened, just briefly, before she smoothed it away. She laughed softly, said these things can be complicated. I agreed. Complications often arise when certainty runs ahead of truth. She asked what that meant for their plans. I told her that meant the house was still mine, unchanged, and that any future decisions would require direct conversation rather than assumption. The room went very still. She said nothing for a moment. Then she asked very carefully if I had known all along. I considered the question. I told her I had known enough. That answer did not satisfy her. She asked how. I looked toward the corner of the room, not directly at the camera, but close enough. I said that when people speak freely, they often forget who is listening, and that records have a way of preserving more than intentions. My son's face drained of color. He understood then what I had not said outright. The camera had not been for my benefit, but it had served one nonetheless. There was no accusation in my voice, no raised volume, just fact. My daughter-in-law stood up, pacing slightly, speaking about misunderstandings, about feeling blindsided. I let her speak. When she finished, I told her that I did not feel blindsided. I felt finally seen, even if unintentionally. I explained that I had no interest in confrontation, but I would not quietly disappear from my own life. The house, I said, was not a symbol or a prize. It was a responsibility I had carried for years, and it remained so. Silence followed. It was different from before, not heavy with assumption, but charged with consequence. My son asked what would happen now. I told him that depended on how they chose to move forward. I was not asking them to leave immediately. I was asking for honesty and for time. Time, I added, that I would define for myself. My daughter-in-law looked at me then with something close to disbelief. Perhaps she had mistaken my quiet for consent. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. That night, I slept deeply, not because everything was resolved, but because it was finally grounded in truth. Whatever came next would not be shaped by silence mistaken for surrender. The days that followed were quieter than I expected, not peaceful, but subdued, as if the house itself were learning a new posture. My daughter-in-law avoided me at first, leaving early, returning late, her movements clipped and efficient. My son hovered in an uncertain middle space, trying to be attentive without being direct, offering help I did not ask for, checking in with questions that never reached what he truly wanted to say. I accepted his gestures politely. Politeness, I had learned, can be a form of boundary when used carefully. There were no arguments, no dramatic exits. Instead, there were logistical conversations carried out in neutral tones. She spoke about needing time to think, about feeling unsettled, about expectations that had not aligned with reality. I listened without defending myself. Defense implies guilt, and I felt none. I spoke only when necessary, choosing my words with care, not to protect them, but to protect my own clarity. The boxes in the hallway were moved again, some pushed further back, others removed entirely. It was a small thing, but it mattered. It was the first visible acknowledgement that the story had shifted. One afternoon, she asked if we could talk alone. We sat in the living room, the camera still present, though neither of us mentioned it. She spoke about feeling embarrassed, about how things had been misunderstood, about how she never intended to hurt me. I believed her. Intention and impact are rarely aligned. I told her that I did not feel angry, only disappointed that I had been treated as an afterthought in decisions that concerned my life. She nodded, though I could tell she did not fully grasp that kind of disappointment. It is difficult to understand harm that does not announce itself loudly. When she asked what I wanted now, I paused. It was the first time anyone had asked me that directly in a long while. I told her I wanted space, not just physical, but emotional. I wanted time to live without being managed, without being discussed in lowered voices. She accepted that, though I sensed it was not the answer she had hoped for. Over the next week, arrangements were made, not hurriedly, but steadily. She began staying elsewhere more often, citing work, needing distance. My son stayed, but he was no longer settled. He asked again if we could talk properly, really talk. We did, one evening after dinner. He apologized, not dramatically, but sincerely, for letting things go as far as they had. He said he hadn't known how to balance loyalty and comfort, how easy it had been to let assumptions stand when challenging them felt inconvenient. I listened. I told him I loved him, that love does not disappear because of disappointment, but that trust, once loosened, takes time to reweave. He accepted that quietly. There were no promises made. I did not ask for any. Promises given under pressure rarely hold. Days passed. The house felt larger again, not because rooms had emptied, but because I occupied my own presence more fully. I moved through spaces without hesitation. I placed my belongings where I wanted them. I reclaimed small routines I had abandoned, sitting in the living room in the evenings, reading by the window, playing music softly without worrying who it might disturb. The camera remained for a while longer. Eventually, it was removed without comment. I noticed its absence only because the corner felt lighter, less watched. That felt appropriate. One morning, my daughter-in-law came by to collect the last of her things. She was composed, distant, polite. We exchanged a few words, nothing personal. At the door, she hesitated, then said she hoped things would be calmer now. I told her I hoped so too. It was true. Calm, I had learned, is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of self-respect. After she left, the house settled into a new quiet. My son and I existed alongside each other carefully, respectfully, both aware that something fundamental had changed. He spoke about finding a place of their own, about needing to figure things out independently. I encouraged him without enthusiasm or resistance. Independence is learned, sometimes late, sometimes painfully. I did not interfere. The unresolved part lingered not in action, but in feeling. There was a sadness that did not resolve neatly, a recognition that some closeness cannot be restored once it has been replaced by assumption. I accepted that. Acceptance, I was discovering, did not require approval. At night, I lay awake sometimes, not from anxiety, but from reflection. I thought about the version of myself who had stood silently behind that door weeks ago, listening to her life being claimed aloud. I felt tenderness for that woman and gratitude that she had chosen awareness over retreat. The future felt open now, but not yet defined. There were decisions ahead, conversations still unfinished. My son would leave eventually, I knew that. What our relationship would become remained uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, the uncertainty did not frighten me. It felt honest. And honesty, even when incomplete, is easier to live with than comfort built on erasure. The mornings became mine again. I would wake to sunlight spilling across the floors, brushing softly against the walls and furniture I had lived with for decades. The house, once heavy with anticipation, assumption, and unspoken claims, now seemed to breathe with me. I poured tea slowly, savoring the warmth of the cup in my hands. The aroma filled the kitchen, and for the first time in months, I noticed it fully, without distraction, without the subtle tension that had shadowed each day for so long. I sat at the table, listening to the small sounds that marked life, the low hum of the refrigerator, the occasional distant bark of a dog, the soft rustle of leaves outside the window. It was quiet, yes, but in a way that felt alive rather than suffocating. My presence in this space was no longer provisional, no longer tolerated out of politeness. I was home, wholly and unapologetically, and the weight of others' assumptions no longer defined me. My son began to call less frequently, at first hesitating as if unsure whether to reach out, weighing the words carefully. I answered politely, casually, never revealing how much I had understood all along. Over time, our conversations deepened, not with explanations or apologies, but with connection. They became lighter, easier, not because resentment had vanished, but because honesty and observation had replaced it. There was no need for awkward pleasantries, no requirement to perform affection. We spoke as people who knew each other's boundaries, and that alone brought a strange comfort. My daughter-in-law did not return, and I did not ask her to. There was no bitterness in that. Some doors, I had realized, close not out of malice, but out of necessity. When a space has been disrupted, its restoration often requires absence more than presence. I accepted that absence quietly, without drama, and found peace in the fact that the house and I had returned to a balance that no one could misplace again. I spent hours reclaiming small territories of the home that had been quietly encroached upon. Drawers were reopened, shelves straightened, photos returned to walls in their original places. Each movement was deliberate, a reminder that I had not disappeared, that my life had not been dissolved by the assumptions of others. I rearranged furniture, not for show, but for comfort, aligning it in ways that pleased me alone. I cleaned, cooked, and walked through the hallways slowly, touching the banister, tracing the edges of doors with my fingers. It was an unhurried rhythm, but it had weight. Every step, every gesture reaffirmed that I had endured, and that endurance carried quiet authority. In the evenings, I returned to the study, the room I had used for reflection and organization during the weeks of quiet tension. I read letters written decades ago, records long untouched, journals I had abandoned when life demanded more attention than reflection. I did not write to anyone. I wrote for myself, recording memories, thoughts, small observations, and feelings that had been buried under years of accommodation. The act of writing became a meditation, a gentle reclamation of time that had been fragmented by others' assumptions. Each line affirmed my presence, my awareness, my intelligence, and my claim on the life I had built. I realized that this simple, unhurried act carried more power than confrontation ever could. Power was not in raising my voice. Power was in preserving my life, calmly, without spectacle. The house itself seemed to respond to this newfound steadiness. The rooms, once heavy with expectation and assumed authority, felt lighter, more spacious. I opened windows to let sunlight fall freely on surfaces that had long been left in shadow. I rearranged the plants in the garden, tending to each one with care, noticing subtle shifts in their growth, marveling at the way life persisted quietly, often unnoticed. There was a lesson in this persistence. Life continues even when others misinterpret it, overlook it, or attempt to claim it. And yet, it thrives when given the space to do so. I thought of myself as part of that quiet resilience, and in recognizing it, I felt more grounded than I had in years. As weeks turned to months, my routine solidified. I walked in the mornings, observing neighbors, noticing the patterns of everyday life that I had once taken for granted. I waved at familiar faces, exchanged small pleasantries, and smiled at children playing in the street. These small, ordinary interactions carried a weight I had not anticipated. Connection did not require authority or control. It required presence. I was present now, fully, in ways that I had not been during the months of assumption, during the period when my life felt temporarily borrowed by others. That realization was freeing. It made every simple act, pouring tea, opening curtains, tending a plant, an affirmation of existence rather than a concession to circumstance. I reflected often on what had happened with my son and daughter-in-law. There was no anger, no need for retaliation. Their actions had been assumptions, not malice. I did not hold grudges. Instead, I held clarity. I had been underestimated because I had chosen calm over confrontation, observation over immediate reaction. That choice, once questioned in silence, had become my strength. I realized that endurance, when paired with awareness, is far more effective than any show of force. Awareness allows you to act at the right time, and endurance ensures you have the patience to wait. My life, my home, my presence, all of these had been tested, and I had passed not through confrontation, but through quiet constancy. Some evenings I would sit by the window in the living room, listening to the house breathe, the hum of the appliances, the creak of the floorboards, the soft wind against the glass. They all reminded me that I was here, steady and unmovable in ways that mattered more than any claim made by another. I played music softly, letting notes fill corners that had once been filled with tension. Sometimes I sang quietly to myself, small songs I had learned long ago, letting the sound linger in spaces that had forgotten the gentle assertion of presence. The act itself was not performative. It was a reclaiming of life, of voice, of quiet authority. The camera, once a symbol of scrutiny and intrusion, had been removed weeks ago. I had noticed its absence only because the corner felt lighter, less observed. Its removal was not celebrated. It was not necessary. Observation, I had realized, is not power when it is not coupled with understanding. I had understood all along, and in understanding, I had preserved more than they could have recorded. I held the quiet record of my life in my mind, in my memory, in my awareness. That record no lens could capture fully. My son eventually moved into his own space, taking responsibility for his own life, his own household, away from mine. He did so respectfully, giving notice, thanking me for guidance, acknowledging subtly the space I had held for him without complaint. Our relationship remained warm, not intimate, not overly familiar, but steady, respectful, and honest. There were no awkward conversations, no apologies forced into words. Silence had been our teacher, observation our shared language, respect our final agreement. I found new rhythms of daily life. I would wake, tend the garden, make tea, read letters or journals, write my thoughts, take walks in the neighborhood, and return home to the comforting spaces of the house. I arranged small meals for myself with attention and care, noticing flavors I had long ignored. I cleaned and maintained the rooms with a slow deliberation that felt both satisfying and affirming. The house was no longer just a place I lived, it was a home that had been restored to me in a way I had not anticipated through patience, awareness, and quiet resilience. At times, I reflected on the weeks that had passed, the wedding, the assumptions, the quiet observation, the eventual revelation of truth. I understood fully the lessons embedded in those weeks. Calm observation is often stronger than confrontation. Silence can be a shield and a tool, not merely an absence of action. Patience, coupled with awareness, allows life to continue uninterrupted even in the face of temporary displacement. I had learned the value of presence, of grounding, and of being seen without needing acknowledgement. Evenings were spent in calm contemplation. I would sit on the veranda with a cup of tea, watching the sky change from gold to crimson to indigo, noticing details of the trees, the horizon, the quiet rhythm of life beyond the walls of the house. The world moved around me, indifferent, and yet, in its indifference, I found freedom. The weight of others' expectations, the need for validation, the imposition of assumption, all had fallen away. I felt whole in a way I had not before. I understood that the real measure of independence is not in arguments won, nor in power asserted, but in the quiet reclamation of self, in the ability to live fully, in the small but deliberate choices that affirm your presence and agency. Months turned into seasons. The house became a space of comfort and quiet joy, the garden blooming under my care, the room was filled with personal touches, the study a sanctuary of reflection. I felt rooted, not tied, anchored by self-respect rather than necessity. I had found a rhythm that was mine alone, and in that rhythm I discovered the deepest sense of peace I had ever known. The past, with all its quiet tension and unspoken claims, remained present in memory, but no longer dictated my days. I had endured, I had observed, I had remained steady, and in doing so, I had reclaimed everything that truly mattered. One afternoon, sitting with the sun warm on my shoulders, I realized I had not thought of the past months with bitterness, only with clarity. There was no need for confrontation, no desire for revenge, no longing for reconciliation. I had discovered that the truest freedom comes not from forcing others to acknowledge your worth, but from understanding it yourself. I smiled softly, quietly, letting the warmth of that realization fill me. I was not alone, I was not diminished, and I was not displaced. The house, the garden, the rooms, and the quiet corners of memory all belonged to me in ways that could never be taken. As the sun set that day, casting long shadows through the windows, I felt a release so gentle it almost went unnoticed. The tension, the anxiety, the quiet erosion of assumption, it had all passed. I had survived not through force or argument, but through calm observation, quiet endurance, and the patient assertion of self. The mansion, my house, my life, it was mine again, quietly, fully, and irrevocably. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and felt a long, slow exhale of relief. For the first time in a long while, I felt free, not because anyone had acknowledged it, not because circumstances had shifted dramatically, but because I had finally allowed myself to live fully, without apology, without compromise, and with the unshakable understanding that my presence, my awareness, and my calm authority were enough. And in that stillness, I knew I had finally arrived home, not just in the house, but in my life, in myself, in the quiet, enduring strength of simply being seen, simply existing, and finally, simply being free.